Welcome back to Pod Save the World. I'm Tommy Vietor.
I'm Ben Rhodes.
Let's start with this new Israeli government because as of, well, not new yet, Tuesday, June 8th, when we're recording this, there still isn't a new Israeli government, but there's this motley coalition of right-wing, left-wing, centrist parties that all just hate Bibi Netanyahu enough to join forces, but they still need to be voted on in the Israeli parliament before the government becomes official. And the Speaker of the Knesset is this big Netanyahu ally, and he's delaying that vote for as long as possible to give Bibi time to just try to fuck it all up, of course. So there may not be a vote until June 14th. In the meantime, Netanyahu is going full Trump on his way out the door. During a speech on Sunday, he said, quote, "We are witnessing the greatest election fraud in the history of the country, in my opinion, in the history of any democracy," end quote. He added that he and his party, quote, "will vehemently oppose the establishment of this dangerous government of fraud and surrender. And if, God forbid, it is established, we will bring it down very quickly." I imagine he means politically, but, ominous. And, this rhetoric, I think, is quite literally dangerous. Naftali Bennett, who will likely become the next prime minister of Israel, had to get more security because of threats. A member of a left-wing party had to leave her home because of threats against her and threats against her toddler. And the head of the Shin Bet, which is the Israeli version of the FBI, basically, issued a public warning about political discourse leading to real-world violence. Unfortunately, that has not stopped other members of the Likud party and a close Netanyahu ally from comparing this new coalition to suicide bombers and terrorists. So, Ben, is excited as I am about the prospect of Israel moving on from Netanyahu, all of this news makes me quite nervous about, the fragility of the political coalition, about all the ways it could get pulled apart, nervous about the lengths to which like a cornered animal like Netanyahu could go to stay in power and not get thrown in prison, right? Because a lot of this is about avoiding prosecution. And then just nervous about actual violence, especially given Israel's history with Yitzhak Rabin and political assassination. So I guess just broad question for you, like how are you feeling about the future of this coalition and like how seriously do you think people are taking this Shin Bet warning?
Well, I think there's the Netanyahu story and then there's the coalition story. And the Netanyahu thing, there are these eerie echoes of, before Yitzhak Rabin's assassination in the aftermath of the Oslo Accords, there was this real incitement, this kind of hate language, that Netanyahu himself, by the way, was a kind of part of.
Oh, yeah.
So clearly there's uncomfortable echoes. But I think the other point I want to make here is that like Netanyahu, like this is who he is. And like some of us have basically thought this for a long time. And yet, he was treated like this kind of, Churchillian statesman by the Republican Party in this country and some Democrats, because he's a well-spoken guy. But like, you didn't have to look that far under the hood to see kind of a pretty ugly far-right, mindset. And like the Republican Party, he has just moved further and further in that direction. And of course, the logical endpoint of Netanyahu's reign is this kind of Trumpian exit, trying to delegitimize all of his opponents and incite hatred and spread kind of weird, quasi-conspiracy theories. So I think it should make people recognize that, again, as we've said a million times on the show, like criticism of Bibi Netanyahu is warranted and giving him a pass, is giving a pass to the kind of garbage we're seeing now. Now, in terms of this kind of bizarre coalition that encompasses Naftali Bennett, the hardline kind of Jewish nationalist right, Yair Lapid, this kind of more secular centrist, Islamist parties, the Labor Party's in there. So that's good.
Barely.
They're in
Clinging.
there. Yeah, they're in there.
Hold on by a thread.
Obviously this is not going to do big things, they're not going to be able to have some big initiative on the Palestinians, for instance, if people are wondering about that. And so not only are you going to have a kind of right-wing prime minister out of the gate in Bennett, you're going to have a very fragile coalition because they need to pass things and keep the government together. They're going to need to kind of be lowest common denominator that can appeal to all these factions. And I think the basic calculation of Bennett and Lapid is, let's just get Bibi out. By the way, once he's out, he can face charges for corruption. So he could really be out of Israeli politics in a way. And that at some point, probably before the mandate for this government expires in a few years, there'll probably be an election. And again, I think while people are right to raise concerns about Bennett, I think it's healthy that they just Israel needs to get past Netanyahu. Like they can't move on. They're kind of stuck in this crazy situation where he's so polarized the country. There have been 4 elections. So if they can get through this and knock on wood without violence, I still think they're huge. I disagree with Naftali Bennett about just about everything. But it's still a step forward because it's a step away from this Netanyahu era.
Yeah, I'm eager for Bibi to move to Mar-a-Lago and start a blog. There's also a lot of interest in like what the coalition could mean or what this new government could potentially mean for U.S.-Israeli relations. And again, like as you were saying, like Netanyahu he's a right-wing Republican, right? And he decided to change Israel's approach to the United States from sort of nonpartisan, statesman-like to being openly hostile to Democrats, in particular Barack Obama, before he then went all in with Trump. And so Democrats now are starting to talk about the post-Netanyahu era with a lot of optimism and that hope that relations could improve. And I actually think there is some reason to be optimistic here. Like you were saying, Ben, Naftali Bennett is extremely right-wing. He's been the leader of a settler movement. He's been openly hostile to the idea of a Palestinian state. Like, we're not going to agree with him on a lot of like big ticket foreign policy issues, but the coalition as a whole will include more moderate ministers. Yair Lapid, who you mentioned is like the secular sort of center-left guy, he's going to have a lot of influence. He controls a lot of votes. Yair Rosenberg, who's this great journalist at Tablet, he described the new government as roughly like replacing Donald Trump with Liz Cheney. But if Cheney couldn't pass anything without the assent of Bernie Sanders, Nancy Pelosi, Ilhan Omar, and Mitt Romney, and if she would get replaced halfway through by Chuck Schumer, which, sounds like a horrible system, a recipe for gridlock, right? And like you were saying earlier, like a reminder of how easily this whole thing could fall apart. But, that sounds better than Bibi, right? And his buddies in the ministries.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the one hand, I agree with that. You'll have, and also like you'll probably have a less emboldened, Netanyahu coming here to lobby against the Iran deal to Congress. And, the Iran negotiations may become slightly easier without the kind of wrecking ball of Bibi trying to enter into American politics. And like you said, even if there are concerns with Bennett, they'll be probably in places like the foreign ministry and the defense ministry, different types of figures. That said, the concerns that have increasingly been expressed, including by us, about the Palestinian circumstance and whether it's in Gaza or Sheikh Jarrah or the West Bank, those are still going to be there with Naftali Bennett. So you don't want to overcorrect where Democrats are like, oh, now that Bibi's gone, we don't even have to think about this anymore. It's all good, No, I mean, the life for the Palestinians will be the same the day after Bibi's replaced as it was before. And the guy who is likely to be prime minister, shares basically the view that there should be a Palestinian state or even equal rights for Palestinians. So, I think, again, this is a step forward, but like a lot of underlying concerns remain.
Yeah. And maybe look, if this coalition can hold and it can be seen as actually delivering for the people it serves and not just leading to like constant elections and instability, you could maybe see more Arab participation in these elections, better Arab turnout, which would lead to more representation, further moderate the coalition as a whole. Again, like I'm just sort of spouting out hopeful hypothetical scenarios, but that's why I think, look, getting past Bibi, we just got to do it. It's time.
That's my bottom line. That's my bottom line.
Me too. And his stupid, annoying son, who's like the Don Jr. of Israel.
He'll be on Cameo. That guy will be on Cameo before you know it.
Oh yeah,
but he won't charge as much as Don Jr.
$500.
Yeah,
it's one of those things where it would be fun to troll him and get him to say something really stupid, but like I don't want to give that little shit money.
I don't want to subsidize. I don't want to give that guy any money.
He sucks. I hate him. Let's talk about Nicaragua. So here's a quote for you, Ben. "We are very close to calling this a dictatorship." That is how Eliseo Nunez, a Nicaraguan political analyst, described Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega's recent crackdown on opposition candidates. So Ortega is seeking re-election in November. And in recent days, he has basically gone all in on attacking the opposition. He charged one leading opposition candidate with money laundering. He has previously placed several others under house arrest. He's also taken steps to basically criminalize dissent in the country and make it nearly impossible to run against him because you're not allowed to criticize the government. Ortega has been the president of Nicaragua since 2007. He's been in and out of government for a lot longer than that. This growing political instability in Nicaragua comes as Vice President Kamala Harris is visiting neighboring Guatemala for meetings about how to deal with corruption and violence in the region and how that's leading to migration to the U.S. from these Northern Triangle countries in Central America. So, Ben, super complicated set of problems for the Biden administration. I think I just name checked like 4 countries. There's a lot of history that we don't have time also to fully unpack about how the U.S. government, toppled or interfered with governments across Latin America,
including
how,
Ortega,
yeah, including Ortega. This wasn't like long ago history.
Yeah,
it's like the 80s, right?
Yeah.
And so, look, obviously, like the U.S. government screwed up a bunch of governments in places, and that's a factor of the instability today. So, I guess my question for you is like, one, given that history, like knowing what the U.S. did, the CIA did, do you think the U.S. can or should respond to these moves by Ortega? Like, are we a credible voice here? And then just more broadly, any advice for the vice president's team as she tries to navigate this incredibly difficult issue she was given by the president?
Well, I mean, look, I think the first thing is there's clearly this kind of, anti-democratic authoritarian trend globally that, it's obviously, I wrote a book about it. We talk about it all the time. And what's interesting is in Latin America, it kind of spans the ideological spectrum, right?
Yeah, left and right.
You've got Bolsonaro down in Brazil. We've talked about El Salvador, where you have this kind of, it's not really left or right. It's just authoritarian. And then you've got a left-wing authoritarian increasingly in Ortega. And that's something to worry about. And I do think that they have to speak to democratic values and try to figure out ways to engage governments, but also kind of civil society actors, people who are being kind of pushed out of discussions. I think, look, for Kamala Harris, it's so hard. I was thinking if we'd done this trip a few years ago, you'd meet with all of the Central American governments. She can't really meet with the El Salvador or Nicaraguan presidents right now, given the direction of their politics, and that makes her job that much harder. I do think, so what would I advise? I mean, first of all, like, set expectations. This is a long-term issue. Like, I totally support what she's doing. I totally support the aid that they've requested for Central America. It will take several years to have that, have an impact, and they should be candid about that. But it's worth doing because I think it can have an impact over time. I think they're going to have to figure out ways to get aid directly to people in some cases, and to the maximum extent you can. Sometimes working through governments is less efficient and more vulnerable to corruption than trying to work with organizations that are on the ground trying to address problems that people are facing. I do think that she was in Guatemala. Like, I think acknowledging history is powerful. I think it matters to people. I remember when Obama would go down there, and of course we get hit with the apology tour, but when he would just kind of acknowledge this history and speak to it, it kind of lowered the temperature a little bit to have a more conversation about what's happening now. So you're not kind of shadowed by history. We visited, the grave of Oscar Romero, who had been killed, a Catholic priest who'd been killed by death squads in El Salvador. And that gesture, I think, for instance, like helped create a different type of conversation. So I think she can do more of that. And because Guatemala, we overthrew the government in 1954. So, we've kind of done this in a bunch of places in Central America. And they have a right to say, like, hey, you're complaining that things are messed up down here, but like, you did have some of a hand in that. I do think acknowledging the history is important. I think her messaging on telling people not to come, I think you can really focus more on it's not that people can't come. They can come through the asylum process. It's the danger of coming. It's the danger of these coyotes and smuggling networks and the fact that, it's not as advertised. And we did some of that messaging with Vice President at the time, Biden, in Spanish. The last thing I'd say, Tommy, and this may sound like a hobby horse, but like, this is why you talk to the Cubans. They have connections with the Danny Ortegas of the world. And I fear that Trump's kind of return to the Cold War in the hemisphere is contributing to the kind of radicalization of the left down there, the Ortega taking this kind of step. Like they keep putting off doing anything on Cuba. They're going to find that a lot of doors are closed that you have to walk through in Cuba. Like you can have a better conversation. We did with a guy like Daniel Ortega when you're not in this kind of Cold War down there. So that I threw out a lot. I'm glad she went. I'm glad she's taken this on. We should be sympathetic about how hard it is, and those are some ideas for how to make it a little bit easier.
Yeah, you're right that this is like a decades long, not generational effort or challenge. You also like the "Don't Come" quote obviously got picked up and sort of became the headline. But I also think I believe I read somewhere that as part of her visit, they opened some center that's designed to walk people through the asylum process, right? So like, she's not saying don't try to get asylum. It's saying like, let's do it through the right channels. Also, Ben, just a random aside. I was reading some article in the New York Times about this like big Bitcoin conference in Miami, and it talked about how they played a video of Nayib Bukele, the president of El Salvador, announcing some bill to make Bitcoin like legal in the country, and everyone stood up and cheered for this dude, like probably not knowing that like a year or so earlier he had marched the military into parliament to try to force a vote on something he wanted there, like more funding for the military actually. So strange bedfellows here.
No, it's. I mean, it is hard enough to solve these problems down there, but with kind of very problematic interlocutors, it gets much harder. And Bukele is like, he's an interesting figure because again, it's just about authoritarianism, and it's kind of veered to the right, but I think Latin America, we have to be mindful. There's some, of the reality that like usually things are better politically speaking, at least in our hemisphere, than the rest of the world. But like as we've talked about in our own country, we're not immune to these strains, and that's certainly the case in our hemisphere as well.
Yeah, agreed. So while Nicaragua is gearing up for this election, Peru just held one over the weekend, and the winner will be the country's 5th president in 5 years. So on Sunday, leftist candidate Pedro Castillo, he faced off against a right-wing candidate named Keiko Fujimori in a runoff election. Castillo is a total political newcomer. He's a former high school teacher and union activist, and he's representing the Libre Party. And he has called for, the state to play a larger role in the economy. He's pledged to focus on reducing inequality and poverty. It's sort of like a socialist approach to the economic issues. Keiko Fujimori is the daughter of the currently jailed former Peruvian president Alberto Fujimori, and she served as first lady after her parents' divorce, which gives me some real Ivanka vibes that I don't love. Fujimori herself has been jailed 3 times and is currently facing embezzlement and election fraud charges that could put her in prison for more than 30 years. Winning the presidency would provide her immunity, and she would also be the first ethnic Japanese woman elected to lead any nation. So that's interesting. This runoff election, it's the second round. The first round was in April. Both candidates got less than 20% of the votes, and neither is like broadly popular. Peru has just been devastated by the coronavirus. They have the highest per capita death toll in the world. And I read reports of an estimated 10% of the population getting pushed into poverty by the virus. So as of right now, when we're recording, nearly all the votes are in, 96%. Castillo is up by 0.2%. Fujimori is alleging fraud because, of course, that's what everyone does these days. International observers say they have not seen any irregularities or fraud. So again, there's like vast ideological differences between these two. Regardless of who wins, neither is going to have a legislative majority, so governing will be tough. But, Ben, do you have any sense of why Peru has just been cycling through leaders over the past few years? I mean, that 5 in 5 years is a lot.
Well, I mean, I think there's so many things that are interesting about this. I mean, first of all, Castillo and Fujimori are kind of like the ultimate ids of the left and the right in Peru.
Yeah.
And so when you have that kind of pure competition between like the most kind of left-wing person versus the most right-wing person, and you see it's basically a 50-50 election. I mean, that says something pretty powerful about how divided this country is. Fujimori, her father, kind of his claim to fame was kind of stamping out and really going after this left-wing insurgent group, the Shining Path. Obviously that had been a terrorist threat, but also there were excesses in how he did that. So there's this kind of underlying history there too of political violence in Peru. Recent years, what they've been rocked by is largely corruption scandals, as we've seen in other Latin American countries, coming to light and just destabilizing governments. I think when I look at this, you realize that the polarization is very powerful right now in Latin America, but it's the pendulum swinging a bit to the left, and so we've talked about this a little bit, but if you look at Argentina and if you look at Peru, assuming Castillo wins, which it seems like he's most likely to, if you look at Evo Morales coming back in Bolivia, if you look at Lula reemerging and poised to potentially take back the presidency in Brazil, like it does feel like even though this is very closely divided and there are these kind of deep corruption scandals in a lot of these places, the pendulum is tilting a bit to the left. And the U.S. is going to have to deal with that. And again, broken record, but one way is the Cubans are usually at the kind of forefront of vanguard of the Latin American left. If you're in full on Trump mode with the Cubans, those conversations get harder, those summits get harder. And so I think that the U.S. is going to have to try to figure out ways to lower the temperature. And we did that like out of the gate, like to again, like Obama went to the Summit of the Americas, like he Hugo Chavez shook his hand. He's like, fine, I'll shake Hugo Chavez's hand. I'll acknowledge the history here. And again, that detox this a bit. The U.S. should not be contributing to ideological polarization in the Americas. I think that's very, damaging to our own interests and ultimately destabilizing these places.
Yeah, totally agree with you there. Okay, let's turn to a very different issue, which is Myanmar. So we've talked about this a bunch, but on February 1st, Myanmar's military staged a coup against the democratically elected government, and there has just been this horrific ongoing crackdown ever since. That crackdown has also included attacks on and the detention of a lot of journalists, including most recently a U.S. citizen named Danny Fenster, who is the managing editor of the independent newspaper Frontier Myanmar. So Danny Fenster was detained at the airport on May 24th. He was preparing to fly home to see his family in Michigan. I don't think he'd seen them in like 2 years because of the pandemic. He's just been in prison ever since. The military has ignored requests by his family and by the State Department to contact him in any way, so they just have no idea what's happening to him. And he's in a prison with a pretty horrifying record from talking to past inmates. So according to Reporters Without Borders, 86 journalists have been arrested in Myanmar since the coup. Journalism has basically been criminalized unless you are, part of state-run media. So this is obviously terrifying for Danny Fenster's family and friends. If you want to learn more about the case, you can visit bringdannyhome.com. Ben, anything else you think we should talk about here? I'm just trying to raise awareness basically about this case.
Yeah, no, I'm glad that we're doing this, because I hope, I know Danny Fenster's case is, the U.S. Embassy is working on that, but international attention is important. In connecting it to this broader point about journalism, like they've tried to basically shut down the internet. They've tried to silence anybody who's just kind of coming forward with the truth of what they're doing in Myanmar. They're trying to turn it into kind of North Korea, not even North Korea light, and it's. On the one end, that's working, in the sense that they have the levers of power. And I should say that you mentioned he's in this place called Insane Prison, which is I know people have been in there. It's people are usually not treated well there. You would hope that he can get out of there soon. But I think more broadly, there's this kind of creeping concern, I think, from people I've heard from in the opposition, that while the U.S. and other countries, and I think at the G7, there'll probably be something on Myanmar, are continuing to kind of reject this coup. There's this, from ASEAN, the Southeast Asian grouping of countries, and, there's this kind of, when maybe we need to talk to the junta. Mm-hmm. I think that there has to be an effort, diplomatic effort, not just to kind of punish the military government, but to make sure that the rest of the world stands firm against an incredibly extremist government that, by the way, has like no support in Myanmar. This is not like a close call, and that is crashing the economy, like casting people in deep poverty, exacerbating every division. So what I'd like to see is pressure on cases like Danny's and obviously other political prisoners and journalists of all backgrounds there, but also making sure that, we're not letting, Myanmar's neighbors off the hook here. Their interests are not served by this. Like, this region will be more unstable, less economically vibrant if this path is the one that they continue to go down.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I can tell, the people who support this coup in Myanmar are like, sort of mid-level Russian generals and Chinese generals who are making visits there. And then like Mike Flynn in the far right here in the U.S. Like those are people who think this is a good thing, which is really scary.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, like it's, if this is the template for the American right, like that's not something you want to experience.
Yeah, some dark stuff. Okay, let's talk about ransomware, Ben, because again, like it feels like there's a new ransomware attack every month. We got meat manufacturers, hospitals, local governments. A ferry to Martha's Vineyard apparently was one of them. Like you name it. Last month, we talked about this ransomware attack on Colonial Pipeline, which supplies fuel to much of the East Coast. Here's a little bit of good news. So the Department of Justice today announced that they were able to trace and seize $2.3 million of the 4.4 million, I think, worth of Bitcoins that were part of the ransom paid out by Colonial Pipeline to this hacking group called DarkSide. Our friend and former colleague, Lisa Monaco, made this announcement. She's the Deputy Attorney General. But while DOJ is busy hunting hackers, Ben, and had some success here, President Trump is floating a different approach for dealing with ransomware attacks that I think we should really take seriously and consider. So here's a clip.
How do we stop it? I mean, the Commerce Secretary says, well, the companies should take action.
Go back to a much more old-fashioned form of accounting and things. You know, I have a son who's so good with computers. He's a young person, and I mean, he can make these things sing. And when you put everything on internet and on all of these machines, you never see a piece of paper. I really think you have to go back to a different form of accounting.
I mean,
well, yeah, there we go. Like pretty soon, Trump's going to be like on those ads on Fox where they're scaring old people into buying gold. You know?
Yeah. I think Rand Paul is on those. Have you seen that clip from like the early '90s on the Today Show where the hosts are like, "What is internet?" They're like talking to the producer. I mean, Trump's response is basically like, "Go back to the abacus." Like, I don't know what this is.
It's like Barron showing him what the internet is. I mean. We do. Feiner is pretty interesting on this. Like this is going to clearly be a subject of growing concern in the White House, but also I think internationally through NATO and other venues, because it's just like we're in a new normal. I mean, Tommy, like watching this, like this is life in the rest of our lives of like this kind of constant asymmetric cyber threat, and Russia clearly doesn't give a shit, and this is kind of part of a because I just don't think that these Russian cyber criminals could operate from within Russian soil without at least a wink from their autocratic government. And so this cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, like this is kind of part of this kind of asymmetric war that we are living in,
Yeah.
So I guess Trump's solution is to buy some gold and put it under the bed. Don't do that. That's not the solution.
Buy gold, print everything out. Go from there.
Print out your receipts, I guess,
Print out your receipts, from CVS and everywhere else. Speaking of technologies that are sort of causing a new normal here. So there was a United Nations report that caught my attention, which said that a military drone used in Libya's civil war last year may have attacked soldiers fully autonomously. In other words, it may have been programmed to just go up in the sky, and if it sees a target, attack it without any kind of data link between that drone and its operator, so there's no human controlling the thing. This report it's a little murky. The details are not confirmed, but it has kickstarted this broader conversation about AI and weapon systems. So this particular drone is made by a Turkish company. It doesn't fire missiles like a Predator or a Reaper drone. Instead, it basically like hangs out over an area until it sees a target, and then it just dive bombs it and explodes a 3-pound charge when it's close to the target, whatever it is. I watched this just terrifying little promotional video of the drone made by the manufacturer. So they show how you can use them in packs to swarm targets. So straight up nightmare fuel, like just a swarm of drones coming towards you and blowing stuff up. But regardless of what happened in Libya, like this tech is coming. It is understandably quite alarming to human rights groups and anyone who doesn't want to be chased around by like a murder Roomba. So there's an organization called StopKillerRobots.org that is advocating for fully banning these kinds of weapons, which sounds great to me. But so far, there's not a lot of momentum behind creating some sort of international treaty to do so. Ben, did this come up at all by the time you were like leaving the White House, and anything you want to say to our autonomous killer robot overlords before it's too late?
Yeah, it did come up. I mean, and again, people will add us on this, and rightly so. But when Obama did put out in 2013, you'll remember we declassified a bunch of information about the drone program, released kind of the legal guidelines. We were trying to kind of identify, okay, here's the standards in terms of avoiding civilian casualties. Here are the circumstances in which we'd use drones, which again, I fully respect went beyond what probably most of our listeners would want the U.S. to be doing. And I think there's a lot of truth in that criticism. Part of the thinking at that time, though, was there's no rules like about this technology and how it's used. I mean, there are rules about a lot of other kinds of war fighting, from particularly like nuclear weapons,
Nukes,
and chemical weapons and weapons
yeah.
of mass destruction, and when you get into not just drones, not just flying robots, but basically artificial intelligence and killing, it's an ungoverned space, and we talked about that a lot and tried to begin to at least model what are norms that could be established and laws that could be put in place that you'd want to see other countries embrace. I think the challenge here, right, is that like Russia and China, who have some of these technologies, are probably not going to be interested in developing a set of norms with us. That, though, I think doesn't mean you don't do it. I think you still, the US and Europe and whatever other country wants to come to the table, like if we're not at least trying to get, not ahead, try to catch up to these technologies, what technologies do you not want to see developed at all? What kind of rules do you want to see govern the development of certain technologies? A lot of the R&D in this kind of stuff takes place in private sector and U.S. tech companies, right? Like so you need to be talking to them because you just have to start to create some principles that become norms. It could become laws, even without the full participation of like the Russians and Chinas of the world. So you have some coherence around these technologies because, 20 years from now, like they're going to be a bunch of killer robots, and I don't want them to become autonomous.
I don't either, man. I mean, it also seems kind of analogous to landmines, right? Like landmines aren't chasing you down, but they are an autonomous weapon that just sits there and kills indiscriminately. And we were able to put some rules of the road around that. I mean, I don't know. Hopefully, someone's working on this problem because you don't want to watch this video of these things swarming. It is not fun.
Well, imagine the January 6th crowd. Like, let's say 10 years from now, like someone can buy one of these things.
Yeah.
Like, imagine if like some of those nut jobs you're setting up like guillotines and Mike Pence effigies on the fucking lawn of the Capitol, like could fly some killer drone. That's that's a real risk.
Yeah, and it's not like advanced technology, right? This isn't like a Predator drone. No. It's like you any drone that could hold like a camera, you could put some sort of warhead on it, something explosive, and fly it at someone and just kamikaze the mission. I mean, it's not great. All right, a couple more slightly lighter topics to close out the show. Yeah. So the U.S. military apologized after U.S. soldiers accidentally stormed an olive oil processing factory in Bulgaria during a training exercise last month. Whoops. This was part of a training exercise where members of the 173rd Airborne Brigade were practicing how to seize and secure an airfield, and they accidentally wound up in a civilian factory. The owners of the factory, they're actually pretty cool about it, so they don't mind the training, but they wish they'd had a heads up because their employees were terrified. It seems pretty reasonable.
I mean, were they making like a bunch of soup or something, and they needed some extra? I mean, like I just don't understand how you like attack an olive oil factory by mistake. With all due respect to the U.S. military.
Yeah, due respect. I think it was adjacent to this airfield, but once you got in and you see a bunch of workers like pressing olives, I don't get how they ended up in there for like 20 or 30 minutes. Just maybe get out because it's a training mission anyway.
Did they think, I mean, I'm so curious from both perspectives. Like, what are these dudes who like go to work and they're just like crushing olives, making some olive oil? Like, what do they think when they see like, the U.S. military kicking in the door? And then what is it?
Terrified.
Did the U.S. military guys like think, well, maybe actually this is part of the drill. Like these guys are, pretending to be, like the whatever their exercise is about, like the enemy's posing as olive oil creators.
Yeah.
I don't know.
At some point when you see like a couple dudes like dipping bread into some sort of like delicious sauce, like maybe olive oil machinery factory. Okay, so maybe there's some dual use. Jordan Waller tells us before we get too far. Look, let us have our fun, Jordan.
I don't think we should even cut this because what I love about this
I want it too.
Jordan Waller, our producer, is saying, before we get too far down this road, because she's anticipating the length of the conversation you and I could have about pressing olive oil. So Thank you for that correction, Jordan.
Thank you, Jordan.
Proving that you keep this show, you are the guardrails on this show. It was olive oil machinery factory. That's just a little bit more plausible.
No, it's a little more plausible.
But I'm glad everybody took that journey with us because it was fun.
I had a blast. Speaking of kind of interesting international stings, so this article popped just before we started recording too. So for years, apparently, criminals have been buying cell phones on the black market that they thought had been like stripped of all the sort of existing software and just outfitted with one secret app that you could use to send encrypted messages. And these phones ended up getting into criminal circles used by gangs, drug traffickers, hitmen, like all the best people, all the folks you want to have encrypted comms. And they so trusted the devices that they didn't even use code in some cases to disguise their activity. They were just like openly talking about shipping drugs or whatever. Well, that was a bad move because it turns out that the entire encrypted network was run by the FBI in coordination with the Australian police. And over the last 3 years, law enforcement has hoovered up something like 20 million messages and arrested at least 800 people in over a dozen countries. It sounds like this is the beginning of the arrests and that they had to go public with this news for, I assume, law enforcement reasons, or maybe the clock was running out on their them being legally allowed to collect this information. But you have to imagine, Ben, that there's a lot of like angry, nervous criminals around the world right now sweating this one pretty hard. So credit to the FBI for being clever. Hopefully, they will also stop demanding backdoor access into commercial encryption apps because fuck off with that. But the big question for me, Ben, is whether the Trump organization, maybe Trump, Jared, Paul Manafort, maybe they got their hands on one of these phones. I could see it happening.
Maybe that like the texting between MBS and Jared was on one of these guys.
I mean, better than WhatsApp, right?
Yeah, come on. I mean, it is just like a reminder that law enforcement can like get at these issues without like saying we need to be in everybody's signal, so kudos. We don't have that many opportunities to give a shout out to the FBI on the show here. Like this is definitely very cool.
Yeah, well done. Yeah. Final story. So this week, Ukraine unveiled a new men's national team soccer jersey, and the Russian government is super pissed off about it. Why? Because the jersey includes a map of Ukraine with Crimea on it included as part of Ukraine. Russia, of course, annexed it, invaded it, Crimea in 2014. And today in 2021, the Russians, the Chinese, they are going to demand that everyone submit to their worldview and that we all say that, okay, yes, the new borders that you guys drew through force or through coercion are the right ones. The U.S. Embassy in Kyiv, we say Kyiv now, we learned that during impeachment, tweeted their support for the new design, which will be worn at the UEFA Euro 2020 tournament. Ben, should we buy a round of jerseys in solidarity? What do you think about this design?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't like it when like, you're watching like ESPN or some Disney movie or something and like, the border of China includes like the 9-dash line, like maritime border of the South China Sea. Like, when have you ever bought anything with the maritime border on it? Never mind a maritime border that claims like an entire body of water. Nor do I think like Russia should be able to tell the Ukrainians that this territory we annex can no longer be in New Jersey. Like, screw that. I mean, people should like kind of demonstrate through their own choices like that they don't want to be bullied into like accepting some political, authoritarian, creepy insistence that everybody like acknowledge the legitimacy of their illegitimate actions. So I'm totally on board with the Ukrainian jersey.
Yeah, it was fun reading the stories because the Russians like they take every slight to just the maximum degree. Like they were comparing the slogan on the jersey to like Nazi propaganda. There were members of parliament that were freaking out. Some of them were just calling the jerseys ugly, which,
Little thin skin, guys. I mean, come on,
Little thin skin. I do wonder, I wonder if they'll do something incredibly stupid and dangerous in response. We shall see, I guess.
Well, they'll probably just like hack the Martha's Vineyard ferry again or something like people, like maybe they'll hack the Cape Cod ferry next. I don't know.
Yeah. They'll just continue to invade Eastern Ukraine. Yeah. Just be a huge pain in the ass. I didn't have time to write this up, but did you see the video before we went in, right before we came in here? Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, was out like on the campaign trail, and some dude started shaking his hand and then just slapped him in the face as hard as he could.
Whoa, no, I didn't see that.
I have no idea what happened. That wouldn't end well with U.S. Secret Service.
Don't support that. Don't support that. I mean, that's the thing is like you can be mad at politicians, but let's not go that route. You know?
Yeah, let's not hit anybody in France, in America, or anywhere else.
Yeah.
Ben, congrats again on the book rollout. It's fantastic stuff, man. Keep moving them.
Yeah, no, keep moving.
Are you still beating? Are you beating O'Reilly? Who are we beating these days?
Well, the list comes out the day that this podcast comes out, so we will find out. Whether
Really?
we've dethroned Bill O'Reilly, who's now going to have the extra advantage of going on a speaking tour with Donald Trump, right?
I learned that yesterday.
If you needed any more incentive, like Bill O'Reilly, best-selling author of the Killing series, currently at the top of these lists, is now going to get further juiced by, his co-partner, Donald Trump. So anyway.
Bill O'Reilly sucks. He's a creepy dude. I have to say, I kind of think we were better off with him over Tucker Carlson. And I never thought I would say that. I hate it.
Yeah, I mean, he was, it was the rampant sexual harassment that brought the guy down. He was basically just kind of the loudmouth guy from the Long Island Railroad, like ranting about his grievances on the train after having a couple of tall boys. But he wasn't as like insidiously dark white supremacist as quite as much as Tucker.
Yeah, the incitement coming out of Tucker's douchey preppy mouth every week is just something new. Anyway, well, we got that to deal with too. So good luck with the bestseller list, and we'll talk to you guys next week.